People who reject the very word of God, people who reject the very word of God.
Welcome to Freethinking 101. My name is Mark Mabry of the Rationalist Society of St. Louis. And today our topic will be, do biblical contradictions hold up? Some time ago we did some programs on the subject of contradictions and absurdities in the Bible, and we really didn't break any new ground. And in fact, a lot of biblical scholars apparently have spent considerable energy attempting to explain the problems in the Bible. Tonight we're going to look at the explanations they've offered and see if they can effectively defend the notion that the Bible is divinely inspired and without any errors. My guest tonight is Pat Inniss of the Rationalist Society, and I was wondering, what sources did you use?
Well, I really felt compelled to go back and examine this issue because Eldon Scholl, well, he's behind camera one tonight, he cautioned me before I did the show that, well, a lot of these things have really already been explained. And actually, we did two programs on the subject of biblical. We covered the Old Testament and the New Testament. And we didn't, like you said, we didn't break any new ground, but, you know, there were pretty good shows. As a matter of fact, one of them, I think, is going to win for us the Malcolm Baldrige Award for quality this year. But what I did was I found the book, by William Arndt, which is Biblical Difficulties and Seeming Contradictions. Now, this, actually, William Arndt wrote two books back in 1926 and 1932, Biblical Difficulties, and the second one was Seeming Contradictions. These books were combined recently in 1987, combined and updated by a couple of authors, Robert Horber, pardon me if I mispronounce the name, H-O-E-R-B-E-R, and Walter Rohrs, R-O-E-H-R-S. These are both professors of exegetical theology at Concordia Seminary here in St. Louis. So these are people that pretty much know their stuff. They went through the original works by Mr. Arndt, as I said, updated them and combined them into this one book, which does a pretty good job of explaining a lot of the things that we cited in the television programs, the original TV programs we did. Like I said, and like you mentioned, they really are classics that have been discussed for centuries.
Right.
And so I just went through and looked at, you know, what his explanations were for these contradictions and absurdities. And
Right. How does he explain some of the contradictions and the problems, the obvious problems that go throughout the Bible?
Well, he tries to explain them with, well, I'd say he has three basic methods, or three basic explanations. One of them is the linguistic excuse, okay? This is basically your translation error. And he looks at problems in the Bible and goes back and compares the English he refers to the King James Version of the Bible, compares the English text to the Hebrew and Greek text, and sort of jumbles all these texts around till he comes up with something that kind of makes a little different sense than what does in the English sense, and says, okay, that's the explanation. There's a lot of linguistic things, you know, figures of speech and stuff like that come in here that, you know, when you say, I guess one of the things is, you say, well, astronomically, there's a lot of things, and we always refer to the King James Bible, since most of us aren't Hebrew and Greek experts, that really don't make sense, like the sun standing still, astronomically, obviously incorrect. And he'll go back and say, well, in the Hebrew version, actually what it says, this is, for instance, he'd say in the Hebrew version, it said that the sun didn't stand still, but it stopped its progress, or something like that. And you say, well, gee, it still doesn't really make much sense astronomically, but it's different anyway. You know, and what you can do is you can sort of shop among the different translations until you come up with one that is slightly less absurd, and then that's your answer. That's one of the tactics he takes. But you know, the thing that gets me about this is, it seems like if somehow all the Hebrew and Greek translations were wiped out, you'd be left with the English Bible, and if that's all you had to go with, you'd be kind of in trouble, because he pretty much admits by having to refer to these translations that they really screwed up when they wrote the Bible, you know, the people that translated it anyway, you know. And even when you look at the Hebrew and the Greek versions, they don't make a whole lot more sense, but that's one of the tactics he takes. Now, the second one is just plain old transcription error. Okay, this is when, you know, somewhere along the line, you know, before they had the Xerox machine, you had these guys that were writing down, copying by hand the text from an earlier version of the Bible, and they may look at, you know, maybe one of the people that copied an earlier version, his penmanship wasn't so good, you know.
Right.
And
Minimum wage workers probably too.
Writer's cramp. All these things can affect your religious belief. You know, they become factors after a while. So that's another explanation. He'll say, well, when you write this is particularly in some, you know, numbers or apparently they use some shorthand abbreviations when they were trying to express certain things. They'll say, well, it's easy if you understand how these numbers or abbreviations were made that you could make a mistake, you know. And you say instead of 100 people being killed in battle, you put 100,000 people being killed in this battle. So, you know, that kind of thing can happen.
Right.
We're only human after all.
Exactly, we are, aren't we? Well, it's interesting that an omniscient God would let linguistic and transcription errors possibly change the course of the religion, and for some people believe that it could change the entire ideas on whether someone could get to heaven or get to hell because of transcription errors.
Yeah.
Could have been.
Well, it gets even sadder than that when you really think of the use to which the Bible has been put in many instances, the use to which religious faith has been applied in terms of warfare and persecution. It's kind of sad. I might also mention there was a third primary means he relied upon, which was kind of just saying, hey, you know, this is poetry in a sense. There's poetic license here. He calls it heroic language. Right. And this is kind of, again, the sort of figure of speech. He says, you really shouldn't take this kind of stuff literally, which is kind of bizarre from coming out of a guy that's basically a very conservative kind of fundamentalist. He believes all this stuff really happened, but then at the same time he realizes that some of it is so outrageous that what they were really doing in the Bible was saying things, couching them in terms that were kind of poetic, were kind of artistic, and not intended to be taken literally. Now, to a person like you and me, this would open up a whole Pandora's box, and you say, well, gee, you know, if this is a figure of speech, how do you know the rest of it isn't a figure of speech? How do you know the whole thing isn't one big poem?
Right.
That really wasn't meant to relate factual events like many people are trying to make it out to be.
Yeah, we're just lucky that most people don't pick and choose history like some people pick and choose from the Bible like that.
Yeah, well, they seem to be doing that. But what he's really doing, you know, he comes down oftentimes to really kind of admitting the contradictions in the Bible in a sense. But then he will say that these things, well, you know, in the instance of things like, he calls them seeming contradictions, like when they say that God is kind, but then you find another passage where it says that he ordered the slaughter of innocent women and children and even their animals a lot of times, you know. And you say, well, gee, that, you know, seems like a contradiction. But then he goes back and he says, well, you know, no, they're not. If you really understand what's going on here, they're not contradictions. We'll get into, I'll give you some examples of that a little later on.
Right, you'd have to use that as transcription error. Oh, the murders, that was error. That was error. You know, actually, he basically admits a lot of times that a lot of the Bible is not necessarily correct. You know, the stories, he tells some of them are stories, translation errors, transcription errors, different things like that. And if the believers admit that part of the Bible falls into that category, I would think that they would be afraid that almost all of the Bible will eventually, you know, the Bible will be thought of as complete fables, things like that.
Yeah, it's kind of a slippery slope, I guess. You think once, well, see, but his approach to it is that he feels that he's not really very sensitive to that, because he feels that Christians, even when he gets into really sticky places, he says that Christians are kind of insulated against logic. That's what he feels. They have this faith that really prevents them from seeing what we would think is the truth. But, you know, even when you pile this mound of factual evidence on top of it, you know, you say, well, this, like, and for instance, he says this about the case of Jonah being swallowed by the whale or the great fish, you know, he explains it well. You know, in the language that the Bible was written, they didn't have this distinction between whales and fish, so we wouldn't even worry about whether it was the Bible says it's a great fish or a whale. But he went to a lot of trouble trying to explain that, and if I can find my notes here, what he did was he found he relied pretty heavily on an example that, an explanation that was printed in the Princeton Theological Review back in 1927. Now you have to realize this book was originally written back in, you know, what I say, the 20s and 30s. Mm-hmm. But in the Princeton Theological Review, now that sounds like a pretty highfalutin place to have your paper published on theology. But there was a guy named Ambrose John Wilson of Oxford, England anyway, published an article in the Princeton Theological Review, which in his mind explained how Jonah could live in the belly of the great fish.
Right.
And you know, now some of it sounds pretty laughable. You know, like for instance, he says here, you know, he says that, well, the fish would have to have some air inside of him so you could breathe, because, you know, he would have to have some buoyancy. You know, now the air, you know, if it's a whale, he probably have it in his lungs, maybe not that much air in his stomach. You know, and he says it's going to be hot in there, 104 to 106 degrees. You know, you could stay in there a couple of days. You know, you take a couple of Cokes and you sit back. You know, maybe
thermal underwear. Well, you would need thermal underwear.
But anyway, also, now this is what got me. He says that. Again, the gastric juice would be extremely unpleasant, but not deadly. It cannot digest living matter, otherwise it would digest the walls of its own stomach. So that's, of course, it's easy, you know, nowadays, of course, you know, most people would be able to tell you that, well, the stomach lining secretes mucus substance, which actually is what prevents the gastric acids from attacking the stomach itself. You could plenty of animals actually do eat their prey live and don't seem to have any trouble digesting them. But, you know, the thing that really gets you about all this is a person that's really kind of an intellectual leader. And you have these professors at Concordia Seminary, religious leaders that hold a lot of respect, very good, you know, influential positions in this country, you have to admit it. Mm-hmm. And yet they're really, in a sense, stripping away from the people that follow them some of their most important intellectual facilities. Freethinkers, skeptics, people that are interested in intellectual honesty spend a lot of time talking about critical thinking, about the proper application of the intellectual facilities, and how it is important for us as a society to be able to question things, to examine issues that surround us in the world, and to be able to make the distinction between what's true and what's untrue, what's right and wrong.
Right, exactly. It insults your intelligence, actually, some of the explanations given insults all reason. It doesn't have anything to do with anything like that. Now that was kind of a commercial for rationalism. If you had some more examples of Christian explanations of the Bible, if you have some of your favorite ones, maybe.
Well, you know, that story about Jonah, I guess, is really one of my favorites. You know, well, I say that, but then I can think of some other favorites. There's a lot of them that come up, but I think the part where Arndt says, in effect, that Solomon was an ignoramus. Now that's got to grab your attention, okay? I mean, King Solomon. We're not talking about Solomon down at the meat market that puts your hamburger, you know, no, this is King Solomon. Now, the problem here is that Solomon practiced polygamy, okay? According to Arndt, and just about every other biblical scholar, I guess it seems to me, polygamy is plainly prescribed in at least a couple of different passages. Genesis chapter 2, verses 18 to 24, and God gave Moses the commandments. And also in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17. But he says, but Arndt says, many of the Old Testament saints disregarded this truth because they were ignorant of it. Now, this is offered to explain how King Solomon could be holy and yet practice polygamy. Basically what he's saying is that King Solomon just didn't know no better. It's an ignorance of the law explanation for this whole thing.
plead ignorance when you don't.
Right. Well, if you look in Kings, in first book of Kings, chapter 11, verse 3, it describes a large number of wives and concubines that King Solomon had. Now, even us free thinkers, wouldn't be too concerned about that. But if you're a biblical scholar, somehow you have to explain that what happened here, because soon after Solomon became king, God asked him what he wanted. God gave him a choice of what he wanted, and Solomon answered that what he wanted was the gift of wisdom. God was mightily pleased by this choice. He said, well, you didn't ask for riches, you didn't ask for the lives of your enemies, you didn't ask to live a long life, you asked for wisdom, so that you can be a good king and judge over your people, to be a good judge for your people, I'll give you the gift of wisdom. And here comes Arndt along saying that, well, I guess God, when he was handing out the brains to Solomon, he forgot this part up here where he told him you weren't supposed to practice polygamy.
Right. So
it's kind of interesting. One thing that gets you about this is that Arndt says, here he says, let us praise the long-suffering of God, who forgives even those errors of which we are not aware and cleanses us from secret faults. Now, here Arndt seems to be making the argument that God is merciful, God is forgiving, and God is willing to overlook the sins of his favorite personalities in the Bible. Now, this is where he's setting up a contradiction himself, because later on, Arndt has to go to great lengths to explain why God would commit some of the, what we would consider, say, genocide, among other things that happened. So it's pretty tough sell in my book, anyway.
Sure. There are a lot of people that have also pointed out the contradictions about Noah's Ark. I know in one passage it had mentioned that there were 7 species of each species going on, and then in another there was only 1 pair of each. Mm-hmm. And I understand Arndt had an explanation as well. Yeah.
Well, I guess I kind of look forward to this one. This is one of the classics. Actually, the Noah's Ark problem doesn't bother me too bad. That part of it, it's like the 2 stories of creation. And Arndt says, well, one is just really kind of a synopsis of the other. It wasn't intended to include all the details and stuff. That's why it's told a little differently. And in a sense, he says that this is the same thing happening here too. Really, what you have to do now is forget about the whole absurd nature of the flood to begin with, okay? That whole scenario, okay, 40 days and 40 nights, and all the animals and stuff like that. But just, concentrate on this part. He says, in Genesis chapter 7, verses 2 and 3, it says, God commanded Moses to collect 7 of every clean animal, okay, and 2 of every unclean critter, all right? Now, later in verses 8 and 9, it reports that of the clean beasts, of the beasts that are of clean beasts, of beasts that are unclean, of birds, and of everything that creeps on the earth, 2 by 2 they went into the ark of Noah, male and female, as God had commanded Noah. Okay. Now, what they're saying is the second passage didn't really mean that he gathered them up 2 by 2. What he means is that they were kind of marching 2 abreast into the ark. That's the whole purpose of that passage, was to say how they filed in, in nice rows of 2. I guess it kind of leaves you, if you get 7 of some of them, I guess some of them are going to have to, you're going to have a goat and a llama or something like that team up, maybe an elephant and a scorpion or something like that. You're going to have some odd couples there. But the idea here is that he's saying, well, he gathered them up in these numbers. Some of them he wanted 7, some of them he wanted pairs and stuff like that. But when they actually filed in, they went 2 by. Now, okay, I can buy that. I mean, I'll grant him that. He says that, well, he got 7 of them because for some of them they had sacrifices in mind. They probably didn't tell some of the animals that if you're an odd number, chances are you ain't going to make it too long after the strip is over, baby. We're going to, you're going to be up on the altar doing your duty to God when this whole thing is over. But that could have caused a little psychological trauma during the journey. They may have been out there praying for more rain, But that's basically how it happened. And, I can buy that. But what I want to know is how they squeezed all those darn animals onto the ark. That's what everybody wants to know. I mean, even if you accept the dimensions that they give in the Old Testament, in the description. I mean, and then you got the logistical problems. You know, you talk about, you know, feeding an army. Well, how do you feed an army of animals? You know, these some of them, you know, like the poor, you know, the pandas. What do they eat? They have to have bamboo or something that only sprouts once, you know. And then you've got some of them that have to, you know, they got dietary considerations, just like some of your religious people. You realize? So hey, you're going to have a huge monumental problem, and it's, you know, a lot of things. Well, waste disposal, we don't even want to get into that. No. Okay. But it just kind of boggles the imagination. But, you know, I'm not sure why he just didn't say, why didn't he just chalk this one up to heroic language or figure of speech or something like that. He could have said that, well, maybe it didn't rain for 40 days and 40 nights, and maybe there weren't actually 2 of every animal or something like that. He didn't go for that. You know, I guess the problem here is that the story of Noah's Ark is so much a part of the story of how we came to be. You know, it is a lot. It's very touchy subject now, of course, because of all the creationists and everything. They're trying to sell us on the idea that the earth was created the same way it is described in the Bible. So maybe you don't want to bring those people down on your head, so you're not going to compromise any on this Noah's Ark story. But he could have said that just as easily as a lot of other things. I mean, it is one of the more fantastic aspects of the whole story of creation and how people evolved, shall we say, toward where they are is given in the Bible.
With God, all things are possible, I guess. And there's also the problem of evil in the Bible. You know, good people do bad things, and this is a criticism that you hear a lot about the Bible. And you know, if people in the Bible are as holy as it says, why do they, including Christ Almighty himself, why do they screw up so much? And how does Arndt handle these questions?
Yeah, well, this is one of those instances where Arndt kind of falls back on the explanation that, well, that's Old Testament, this is New Testament.
It's a new world, right?
Yeah, there's a new law laid down by Christ. Now, you know, if you go back and you read the New Testament, of course, you can find passages in there where Christ seems to be making a blanket endorsement of everything that happened in the Old Testament. So that's kind of, you know, kind of a shaky argument. But even then, it really doesn't explain a lot of the things that happened in my mind anyway. For example, they had the instance of the slaughter of Baal's prophets. That was in the first book of Kings, chapter 18, verse 40. Okay, now he says that was justified under the Mosaic law, but repealed by Jesus. He says it was right under the Old Testament. It would be wrong today. Explains a lot. You know, he uses that to explain a lot of the violence in the Old Testament. But you know, once again, you know, the fact is that these were very violent acts. They were mandated by God, and they do even today serve as an example for some people in how some people don't believe in the New Testament. You know, so what you know, where does that argument go? The Old Testament remains, and the violence in the Old Testament remains, in a sense, a very real threat in the modern world today, as an, you know, when used as an example for behavior.
It explains a lot of the oppression of a lot of people as well.
Yeah. Well, the question of slavery, then, speaking of oppression, there was an instance in the Bible where they took slaves, and in Numbers chapter 31, verse 18, God commands the Israelite men to, quote, keep alive for yourself all the young girls who have not known a man intimately. Now, this has certain salacious overtones, I guess you might say, but Arndt says that the murder of all the non-virgins was okay, since these women, in the Old Testament anyway, was okay, since these women undoubtedly led the Israelites into the immoral worship of Peor, one of the competing gods. He goes on to say that God's commandment did not imply that the Israelites should engage in sexual relations. Okay, it was just the fact that the fact that they were virgins was just related to the fact that they hadn't really been knowing any of the Israelites. Now, they didn't mention anything about, you know, punishing the Israelites that had known non-virgins.
Right.
But then again, he says apparently he totally misses the fact that they're taking these women as slaves, women who hadn't really done anything. He doesn't really attempt to explain that, or to explain the fact that that slavery is given a sanction in this passage of the Bible, and of course that in a relatively recent American history, passages such as that were very important to people who were arguing for the continuance of the institution of slavery. They could point to the Bible and say, well, God commanded it in this case to take slaves.
Exactly.
How could it be that bad? So the Old Testament and New Testament arguments really is something that, well, it's like a lot of things. If you have to be a biblical expert to explain these things, and you still don't come up with anything better than what Arndt did at that time, then really the Bible is less than useless, and it's something that is, as I guess I said, a threat, really more than a threat. It's a danger to our intellectual development, and also to our moral development as well. It's very important for people to be able to use reason, to apply reason to our everyday situations. And the application of it, as you see in the Bible, isn't a good example, very good for people to follow.
Exactly. Sodom and Gomorrah explains a lot of why people feel that the civil rights of homosexuals don't count as well. Well, thank you, Pat. I think it's been interesting. This has been the Rationalist Society of St. Louis. Let me see, you can write to us if you'd like to share some of your thoughts with us. Our address is P.O. Box 2931, and it's St. Louis, Missouri 63130. Or you can leave a message in our voicemail box. The phone number is 314-298-6649.